use in classrooms.
Yeah, some people probably will have to share, I think there are like 10 copies.
I'm about to run out. There you go. Yes, I was going to feed that to your. This.
No, you're not distracted.
No, those are features.
I can.
Dan's sitting here, but those are features.
Here, I can scoot down. There's no problem. Where I'm sitting, I can't get out of the camera.
Look studious.
I'm gonna try.
You can see.
I've spent a career doing that practically.
You guys see the whiteboard? No.
So I guess one of the questions is, and I realize that not everybody, well, there are only a few people who, there's 2 people right now who may answer this question. There have been a few questions about childcare options and things like that.
Really singled out.
No, but the Apolytegies asked as well, but they're not here tonight, and see, I just singled them out. And so, but I was just wondering if you guys hear saying like, oh well, I would like to come, but there's no childcare, direct them my way, and we'll see what we can kind of work out. So that's like the practical things. Has everybody gotten a chance to read maybe the preface and the chapter? If you haven't, well.
I didn't get my homework done, teacher. Dog gets my homework.
Well, I thought we could trust you above all people as a school teacher.
She could run childcare.
She may have to. So I chose this book, partially because Father Jeremy, who wrote it, is my spiritual father. We have known him for 6 or 7 years now, 6.5 years, and we were living in Oklahoma. He is the one that I talked about going to seminary with for 2 years. He's a lovely person. He's a monk. He's Archimandrite at Pyramid. And it's very funny. He's the highest ranking priest in the Archdiocese right now. And he's the proto-singularist, yeah. And he it was always funny to me because we would serve together at different churches in New York, and he'd come with St. Joseph, and people were always kind of like in awe, and insider because my kids would run up to him and give him big hugs and sit on his lap during coffee hour and stuff like that. So we've gotten to know him really well. And this book, I wasn't mentioned in the acknowledgement, so it's a little about that because I feel like I did have some early discussions with him about it, but whatever. And so Father's he's a former Protestant. He grew up. I want to say he grew up Lutheran or something like that. He grew up in Kansas, in a very devout household. And he became Orthodox when he was in college. He converted at the cathedral in Wichita.
Under Bishop Basil.
Under Bishop Basil. He knows Bishop Basil very, very well. Loves Bishop Basil.
Always single? He was always single?
He's always been single. Yeah, he felt if I remember the story right, early on he's brilliant, which is some of part of this book, but he felt an early calling to monasticism. Bishop Basil encouraged him to explore other options before landing on this one. He was in his early to mid-20s, I think. And he said, well, I'm interested in medieval studies. He went to University of Toronto to pursue an MA and PhD as a medievalist. And then after a semester or so, he called Bishop Basil, I believe, right? It may have been Father Paul, one of the two, and said, I want to be a monk. This is not what I want to do. And so he came back to Wichita, and then he was in seminary, I want to say maybe the next year. And so going to seminary, he never quite knew how to handle this idea of sacrifice. He always there was always this cultural cloud of how sacrifice is perceived. And you know, he mentions that in the chapter. Sometimes it's perceived in a positive light, but nobody wants to do it. Sometimes it's perceived in a negative light, like, I gave up everything for you, I sacrificed my life, and this is the thanks I get. And then sort of in that mediocre light, or that middle way. And he just never quite knew what to do with it, so he started studying. He's like, well, what do the early church fathers have to say? This is where his academic prowess comes into play. He found Cyril of Alexandria's commentaries on the book of Leviticus. You know, understand sacrifice, well, that's where you start. The problem is they were in Greek, so he just started translating them himself. And it was really interesting, and it started off as an academic pursuit. He talked to St. Vladimir's about getting these to English, and they were kind of pursuing that. But in doing that, he started talking to parishioners about it, and people were like, oh, this is actually really interesting. So he made a class. The class ended up being kind of a proto-outline of what the book would be. Like 6 weeks long, then he expanded it to 12 weeks. He did it again a few years later. And it ended up being kind of the outline of where the book was. And so instead of an academic pursuit, he made it popular. And so I mean, there's some interesting thought. There's a lot of good material, but he wanted actually to make it accessible to people other than just academics and Old Testament scholars. And so I think he does a really nice job of taking the historical into account, taking the theological into account, and then toward the end of the book, it's like, okay, what do you do with this? I mean, you've got the information, so what do we do with this? How does this apply? And so I think that's a good enough intro. I would say the way I in truth, I'm not sure how this has worked in the past. What I would like is a lot of discussion. I've got the discussion questions. I don't see it's a book discussion, so I don't see myself as needing to reteach it. It's there in the book, but let's kind of try and flesh some things out and talk about it as we go on. And I normally I think 45 minutes is normal, so start at 7 and end at about 7:45. Yeah, so anyway, all that said is, having read that in the preface as well, how have you used the word sacrifice or heard it used recently?
Not really used that much.
It's used in baseball.
It's true.
It's used more in games,
Sacrifice fly.
you know,
They don't do it very good in baseball.
chess.
Yeah, sacrifice
I was
flies.
thinking the same
Yeah.
t-shirt, actually.
I say marriage.
Marriage, yeah.
Marriage is a sacrifice. That's what people always like.
Motherhood's a huge sacrifice.
Yeah.
And I think in our recent conflicts that we've had, the field of battle,
Yeah.
people being honored as heroic.
Yeah, I mean that's where I go. I had an acquaintance who lost his in Afghanistan, and his sacrifice when it was talked about, and they kind of broke the news to those of us who worked with or near him. I feel like I've heard it recently economically with like the high inflation. It's time to tighten our belts and make some sacrifices.
Yeah, probably mentioned that we need to
yeah.
sacrifice.
Yeah. And so, and with, I don't need to stick to the political, but that's where I've been hearing it, with the gas shortage in Europe. It's like, well, Europeans are gonna have to sacrifice their comfort this winter, for, because and stuff like that. So that's kind of what I've been hearing. And in my context, one of those is like painted in a positive light, but like Father Jeremy kind of mentions it, there can be a jaded perception of looking at, so, well, what did he sacrifice for? We shouldn't have even been there in the first place. But then, definitely when it's time to like sacrifice our comfort, or the price of bacon doubles and I've got to sacrifice my breakfast due to food shortages or something like that. That's sort of this negative connotation. Anything else? Any other thoughts?
Exactly. Go ahead.
I didn't read, but that concept of sacrificing your comfort is kind of a real odd thing. Or esteeming comfort as something that's valuable, which it really isn't from a Christian standpoint. We're not meant to pursue comfort in some way. We're meant to pursue virtue, right?
Yeah.
We sacrifice our comfort. The way it's supposed to work is you sacrifice comfort to attain virtue. So it's kind of an upside down thing to say, well, I'm sacrificing my comfort because I want more of it and I can't have enough.
Does that mean that you can only sacrifice what you own?
Yes.
So it's as though you own comfort, that's a
Right,
right
exactly.
you have,
That's a
and
right.
then
I
you're
think
gonna
it's like,
sacrifice it.
it's a right, that's what he
Yeah,
feels.
it's more
Yeah.
right.
Right, something you're owed, yeah.
I mean, we're Americans too.
We're
We're
entitled.
Yeah.
We're entitled.
right,
We
right,
deserve it, whatever.
right. I thought it was a good one too.
Break today, stand up and give away.
All right, well, do you hear about sacrifice often in church?
Well, pasta,
Love the sacrifice.
in the spring, when we have Lent, we do a lot of that stuff.
What came to mind when we were reading was the sacrifice of praise.
Yeah.
Sacrifice of praise.
Oh,
And we're supposed to be a sacrifice ourselves.
That's like your
Living
term sacrifice. I don't know if that's what you're asking, do we get here?
I think both, yeah. I think the term, I can think of two instances just off the top of my head in the liturgy. And they, sacrifice of praise is one, and Reader Moses said the bloodless sacrifice.
I think of Psalm 50. Sacrifice to God's broken spirit.
Yeah, that's right.
In fact, sacrifice, I will sacrifice a sacrifice of praise to the
Well, and I think that the one that really kind of piqued my interest was
What does that
what does that mean? That's,
Excuse me,
don't steal my line.
That's what it means.
But that's the thing. It's like,
You gotta know.
so like, in our cultural context, what can that mean?
Yeah, it's really.
well, I think what it doesn't mean is, I really don't want to sacrifice it, but I'm just begrudgingly gonna do it. It doesn't mean that.
Yeah, exactly.
So what does it mean? But that's the feeling, unfortunately, or the implication you get from it in our comfort zone. Well, okay, I'll praise instead of, you know, doing something else, watching TV.
Instead of
That's not-
the phrase there.
Instead of, yeah, so obviously,
Opportunity cost.
it's not a very big.
Yeah, that's right, yes, let's get e-commerce.
Is it
Right.
sacrifice and offering are
An expression of joy.
Mhm.
Yeah, and you know, context, it's there's a great, well, not great, I may be great, I don't know. General Patton in World War II, in one of his famous speeches, he was like, he said, country, let somebody else, like, you know, go out there and make somebody else die for their country. You know, and it was just sort of this idea, like we look at certain sacrifices as noble, but even when wore a different uniform than this, I didn't want to die for my country. That wasn't the goal. I mean, even the most gung ho Navy SEAL Special Forces guy, like, I don't. It's honored, and it's considered honorable.
And it's in the options list.
Yeah,
It's the last option.
yeah.
But it's an option.
But that said, within that context, that's the only positive I really think of that we use the term sacrifice, but that doesn't apply to sacrifice and praise. And the same thing can be said for any of the negative connotations too, because there's joy attached.
I like that. I forgot who said that. Was it Cindy? Who did that?
Mhm. Offering
Well,
versus.
yeah, there's a connection between
Yeah.
offering and sacrifice.
Yeah, I like
It's like you're, yeah, it's like a, forgive me, Father, it's like a happy offering.
Yeah,
Yeah, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I'm definitely interested, that's such a great contrast, in what, if there's a difference.
Well, if you think of like some people, you know, when we talk about tithing, we talk about tithing a lot in this church. You know, and before you commit to that concept, you're just like, well, it doesn't work out, the math doesn't work.
It never does.
The math does not work.
Mhm.
And if you just do it, it works out somehow. Doesn't make any sense, it doesn't, yeah, like I'm saying, it's like but it's an offering that it's joyful when you can participate like that. So there's that participation. So it's
I
the
like that.
participation, the offering, and that sacrifice becomes something other than a negative thing.
Well, and you gotta be thinking about the tradition that I grew up in, which makes a distinction between tithe and offerings. Which I think is pretty ubiquitous, but I mean, we certainly, it was like your tithe and your offerings, and I had to have that spelled out mathematically for me, so, well, it's 20%, but that's what we're saying. But, you know, I thought, well, let's just say you're tithing 20%, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
There was
there's a
some kind
different
of,
component to it.
yeah, I like that.
I think you'd call it a twive.
Yeah, that's right, so tithe. I just noticed that the word, I wanted to say offering of praise, but I also noticed that there's a twinge of difference in my mind that is difficult to articulate between a sacrifice and an offering. And yet, I also think that they're connected, so I love that contrast, I don't know what to make of that.
First chapter, he spends a lot of time talking about the really, really, really joyous nature of their perspective of
Mhm.
sacrifice. Spends a lot of time on it, like, yeah, no, that's not at all. So to reacquire that sensibility is gonna take some work.
I just came up with my idea, because the sacrifice back then, you had to bring a turtle dove, or if you're a little bit richer, I'll make this up, have to be Leviticus again to understand, but you would bring a bull or whatever. But there are certain things that require certain animals, so you were giving something that you brought up in order to. Nowadays, we have dogs and cats, and we go to the supermarket, so I think that's one reason why we lost this you know, that all these animals are being sacrificed, but they come to us in burgers. You know, so
Well, and also,
No, it's just serious.
Please,
And
please
there's-
don't type your dog or your cat.
Right. No, but
We
I'm-
don't accept that.
Well, what I'm saying is,
I'm kidding,
Think about how it's walked. I don't know.
right. No, what I'm saying is, back then, you would offer what you brought up.
yes, Yes.
Or you raised. And here, as money, you make and you offer it.
Yeah.
So there's a difference between
Yeah.
killing an animal and
It
say,
is.
here's my $10.
yeah, there's something a lot more tangible there.
There's
Yeah.
the part that makes me wonder, but anyway.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
mentioned that our, like our pasta baskets would look a lot different, back in the day. I think a lot of them go to the store,
It's Starbucks baskets.
yeah, right, you kind of pick up your flesh meats and,
Yeah.
your curdled milk, and have it blessed, but it's probably like, there's, I mean, I don't know, I guess you probably killed the fatted calf like the day before, kind of thing, in preparation for it, and I don't know if that would extend also to like when you do the fruits as well, because that's still an offering of a kind, right? Like, it's-
Well, so that fruit that you're talking about, Alex, is, again, back in ancient Judaism, the different holy days that, okay, I'm gonna struggle here, you guys, because I'm gonna say we, because I was raised with this. But, one of the things was for the fall harvest. So your sacrifices were they weren't animals, it was grains and fruits and, there's no blood here. Sacrifice, it's still an offering,
It's like a cut of your
which is,
cross.
going back to what you're saying, the distinction between offering and sacrifice gets pretty gray, because in some contexts, they're in
I was curious about that, so that's helpful.
So,
Because when, I was thinking one of the differences I hear between sacrifice and offering is one is bloody, and the other seems bloodless. And it's just, that's maybe the only difference I would see, but that's not because I read ahead. I have no idea where this is going, so I'm curious.
Yeah, and he does touch on that, or not touch on that, he
Elaborate.
fleshes a lot of that stuff out in later chapters. It's divided into 4 sections, and so the next sections, I think chapters 4 through 6, are all on Old Testament sacrifice and kind of explaining some of those things.
So I guess
But
maybe
yeah, I find that
as
interesting.
long as maybe semantic, it just sounds like how things have changed. So in that way, like.
Right.
Oh,
was
right.
something that was, like, I guess ennobled in the sense, like you were offering like something worthy, and now like,
So you played.
you're playing, like you're this, you know what I mean? Like,
Right, well, and
split.
I think it's, what he really drives home, and this kind of leans into the next, is that the way we look at sacrifice is that it always centers upon loss. It's always a loss,
as opposed to a gift.
as opposed to a gift or,
Even a shared joy.
I'm not-
exactly, I mean, yeah, I mean, and like, on the one hand, I mean, I can invite you over for dinner, and we can just have a great evening. We can have a delicious meal, not on a Friday or Wednesday, probably. I mean, it can still be delicious, but you get what I'm saying. Now, like, and it can be this really wonderful experience, and in modern terms, well, there goes $150 of my own dollars. What do I have to show for it? It's like, but I think in the sense that he is starting to get at is that there's this idea that like sacrifice is inviting somebody into your home, and you're laying out this really nice meal and nice bottles of wine, and you have just this joyous time together. Yeah, you have to actually, in a sense, give up something what you get in return. It's something much more beneficial than that extra $100 in my wallet.
But that's a case where like, we're also getting something out of it though, where we're getting pleasure in another person's company.
But that's so
But-
selfish, you want to get that, like, and it's-
I guess so, but like, how can we actively cultivate the joy in
and sacrifice in every decision of our life. As oftentimes as we do it, we also often turn ourselves into the victim. Like, oh, yeah, it's a thing that that I deal with all the time. But I know that I don't have active joy in sacrificing, for the glory of God. I'm often complaining about everything.
When I ask her to take out the trash, she's like, oh, thank you. He's saying this and that's
You have the spiritual gift of complaining.
I don't.
I have a student.
I think so in a sense, a lot of the sacrifice we probably encounter personally is probably more transactional in nature.
Yeah.
And so, so sacrifice is really just kind of another form of payment.
Have you seen the movie Babette's Feast, Father?
I have not.
Oh, that is
That
good.
might have to be an assignment, maybe halfway through the book.
All right.
Not right away though.
Yeah,
All right.
It's sort of, it's over the top, just puts a nail in it. So, that was a requirement from the bakers, especially Grace bakers, to make the.
That is to say that sacrifice, but it's still in a sense transactional, even it's like you're offering these gifts and kind of in return for having communion, which is eternal life. So there's sort of as you can't really avoid the transaction.
Is it though? Transactional or relational? That's always intentional. I mean, the people of God have always sort of descended into a transactional, what's in it for me, and try to, they make their phylacteries long, they're like the best seats in it. But that wasn't what it was made for. One of the things that just came to my mind is that we used to have a form of this that we don't really use very often. Because we met every day, we always something to our kids' feast day. So on St. Michael's Day, whatever, it's like, oh, it's Michael's feast day. So the days before, what do you want to make for your feast day, Michael? Blah, 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 blah. And so we would always think about it, we try to figure out how much it was, and you bring it and say, oh, it's so-and-so's feast day, and they think that's usually come and bless them and all that good stuff. But you definitely had something to share, and it was very much a joy. It was huge. It's like there was we're super busy, and it's like Dana forgot. I forget what it was like Gabriel's feast day. I think it's first feast day.
So it's the last kid problems. That's the.
Oh yeah, she was just heartbroken because it was supposed to be July 13th, but it turned out that it was on his actual birthday, and his middle name became his feast, his patron. So it was providential. But that offering, that sacrifice, that joy, that shared thing, it's like nothing there.
It seems like at the very least it has to be meaningful. A sacrifice is not taking money and flushing it down the toilet. Or whatever. Like there's something, I don't know what it is, but it just seems like that. Whatever if you take
So
giving or
has purpose.
it's
So,
yeah,
I mean, I
something.
think that kind of goes back to a little bit what Reader Moses is it's like, there's a relational aspect
I like
of
that.
sacrifice that we've lost, and perhaps, again, forgive me if this is just boring, but I keep going back to like the Medal of Honor winner who sacrifices himself for his brothers so that on the battlefield, and it's like maybe that's why we honor it, because there is that relational aspect of it. It's a negative thing, we don't want to do it, but there's an echo of perhaps like Father Jeremy is getting at in this book of what true sacrifice looks at in perhaps that situation.
Is it like a willingness versus like imposition?
Yeah, perhaps. But even, well, yeah.
Well, they like even I remember it was mentioned last year, but it was a Friday and I came home and I just kind of remember working from like 3 to 7, and I was like, I'll
awesome. Like, I didn't feel like a sacrifice because I got something done that I actually thought was gonna be really good.
Yeah.
But then, you know, you're like, oh, like, now what do we have to sacrifice? The guys, like, years, you know, like, because I feel like it's imposed, like,
Yeah.
by someone, and you're like saying,
Yeah.
I don't see this as very valuable, it's more like an imposition.
Right. Right. And yeah.
But even when it's imposed though, it doesn't have to be, onerous. The martyrs definitely didn't go out and knock on the door and say, please martyr me most of the time. 99%.
Except for Ignatius.
Except for Ignatius,
Yeah.
right?
Over here.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
really hard not to read him.
Yeah, he's great, I love everybody. Don't you dare try to free me. But like another scene that just pops in my head,
Life is Beautiful.
Yeah.
at the very end of life, goes and says his goodbyes to, you know, his loved ones, with a big smile. Martin, like, that wasn't fake,
That's fiction.
that wasn't done. The martyrdoms were not fiction.
I'll say Life is Beautiful, yeah, I was like,
The martyrdom, do you read the lives of the saints? Do you even have
what about
hagiography,
Life
bro?
is Beautiful?
Do you even have hagiography?
And the Holocaust, the guy doesn't like it 12.
So
I'd like to just go back to a second, something
Yeah, go
Alex said about being transactional. And I'm the relational piece, but I'm not sure that it's an either or. I think it can be, and I'm not advocating this, I'm just saying, I think it can be at least experientially both. It can be both relational and relational. Whether that's right or wrong is a separate question, but, you know, I'm just saying that I kind of get what Alex is saying, because as I'm thinking about it, I'm realizing, like, even with the sacrifice of praise, you know, when you give a sacrifice to God, you know, it brings a joy into your being, which is in a way its own reward, its own, you know, giving praise to God results in a better state of mind, a
Well,
better
it's
state of
changing
spirit.
us. Yeah, I think it actually changes us. Or it has that potential.
Yeah. Anyway, you know, I mean, right now.
no, I mean I see the tension. I mean, again, it's an imperfect analogy, but like inviting you over for dinner and having a great time, bottles of wine, red meat, all of those things in great company. It's like, I don't know, you get something out of it. Like, I mean, there's relational, but in some sense it like, there is a sort of transactional feel. And so I think there's a tension, but I don't necessarily know that perhaps we're talking, perhaps it's motive. I mean, like so many other things, it's like motive. It's am I doing that because I want something more out of you? I want.
Expected, like trade versus being given as a sacrifice.
Exactly. It's like, do I do that so that like when the rolling blackouts come through, my house isn't affected because I know some guy on the inside, or am I enjoying the company, or is it just for that for the friendship?
I like that you said enjoying the company, because it makes me think, when you said, do I want something out of you? And then I thought, or do I just want you?
Yeah.
And then suddenly, what we say about God, he just wants us. He doesn't want something out of us because we have nothing to give him. That's kind of an interesting distinction. So it's not that I get something out of a sacrifice.
I do.
It's not that I'm not pleased by it. It matters a lot though what it is that pleases me. And if it's simply pleasure that has nothing to do with relationship, that's one kind of life. Things like conversation and all that stuff that can please you, it's sort of healthy to be pleased by. Like you should be pleased by that stuff. That doesn't mean you're selfish. Like I really want to meet with you so we can have a conversation because I'm really selfish. It doesn't feel. Whereas, if you know somebody in, I don't know, let's say SoCal Edison, who can keep my house lights on, that's different,
Turn off the blackout.
There's gotta be one of 537 College Lane.
That's true.
Ken has a special list. We can spin your meter backwards.
So, we've kind of in a roundabout way discussed the next two discussion questions and somewhat. So we'll kind of just close, maybe think about the last question. In your mind, sacrifices need to involve in order for them to be joyful. That is something people are eager and excited to do. And I feel like we've been hitting on this.
That's something. It's good.
But,
I mean, that's what I asked early on, no one answered me.
I was waiting until after.
what's your answer?
No, no.
We'll go back.
Ask the question.
Well, I mean, I think the relational aspect of it is something.
Perhaps that it has to be made in love.
Yeah.
If it's made in love, then there will be joy involved.
Yeah.
And if there's no love involved, then what is it? And where is the?
Yeah.
That makes me think of a woman that anointed Jesus, right?
Okay.
She wasn't obviously looking for anything in return, yet he said to her, for all of time, all around the world, no one will we remember. And so, the cheating, but sacrifice has sacra in it, which is holy, so it's like, I think sacrifice is the normal things that the unholy or the less holy does to the holy.
Wait, can you say again?
It's the obvious, normal response of the unholy or the less holy to the holy. It's just normal. I mean, that's what you do. It's kind of like esteeming and so.
So kind of like worship,
In a certain way, yeah.
as opposed to like
But when you
veneration.
think about like the three sacrifices, the one Abraham, and I love Jesus' response to the lady with the 2 mites. And again, she wasn't looking to see if Jesus is watching. You know? It's like, watch what I'm giving. And so the transactional nature of it wasn't even in the heart when it happened. Yet in the mind of God it was, because he was not going to let that go unrewarded. And so I think part of it, I think what you're talking about, it's in our way, is when we go into whatever sacrifice it is, whether it's taking out the garbage or keeping your mouth shut or whatever, with an idea of how it's going to benefit me, even if that thought's only like a microsecond. And that prevents true holy sacrifice. It's the one thing that really, you finesse yourself out of the spirit of it. And obviously this is a mystical thing that has to be worked in your heart, etc., to get to that point.
Yeah.
But, so I remember, I think it was Father Josiah said, he was, whatever you do great, first thing you do is forget about it and go on to the next thing. Or what you think is good, whatever you do, it's like, forget about it, move on.
There were, I don't know, 2 images kind of coming to my mind a little bit. The first was when we were assigned to the cathedral. They have this ongoing major renovation project. And I remember my daughter, she brought $1 to church one day, and she's like, they've just got all this construction going on, and I just want to help them get it done, and it was really funny because that same day somebody then wrote a $10,000 check, and I saw that one too, and it was like, they're pretty equal. It reminded me of the story of the 2 mites, and it may be more than equal, and if they were both done out of joy, both done out of love and with joy, they're definitely both good and acceptable sacrifices.
I'm thinking that Eleanor's dollar was that 3 loaves and 5 fish.
It
That turned into, you didn't give the dollar.
That's true.
Same
I like
thing.
I like that. And then again, the other one that kind of comes to mind, and I truthfully, I don't remember if he touched on this image, but, returns. The father goes out and kills the fatted calf and throws a party, and, I mean, based on some of his descriptions, I mean, that's a sacrifice, like that's an actual sacrificial scene of what that in antiquity would have known exactly what's going on. And it's a scene of great joy and rejoicing. And in fact, the older brother is almost painted as the villain of the story. He may be painted. He is the story. And it's not because he did all the right things, but he didn't. It's sort of almost a Cain and Abel. His sacrifice wasn't acceptable. That's all. I've got nothing more. No other commentary.
It's funny that you bring up the prodigal son though, because the one thing, I love what you were saying, was amazing. The immediate thing that occurred to me is Jesus as a sacrifice for us is exactly inverted
Yes,
from
exactly.
the world. So God sacrificing for us is the opposite completely. It's not the natural response. And the prodigal son is exactly that, a sacrifice in the opposite direction.
Even the prodigal son story is another one for translation. It's like the father's like, your brother was dead.
Yes.
He's back in a relationship with you. He's like, well, you didn't do this for me, and this, and I did this.
I just wanted to go with my friends and like, yeah.
It's like, what do I get? It's like transactional life.
Would this book ever deal with how sacrifice can lead into a more of an eternal relationship? Because when we were talking, I was thinking about Kirk, where he gives certain allegories of what Abraham felt when he was called to sacrifice his son. And in it, Kierkegaard was explaining that you sacrifice. He had to realize that he was doing it for God, and that his relationship with God, and it was eternal. It was eternal. It was something to bring the physical into the eternal. I know.
No, I think you're. No, I understand that, but and I think the shorter answer is yes, in several weeks.
Right.
We should probably wrap it up for the. So the last thing I'll say is my plan is to do one chapter each time. If that doesn't seem like it's working, or we need to step things up,
Slow it down.
or Mike.
Make a sacrifice.
Christmas is coming, okay? We've got to be done before then at least. But if we need to speed it up or something like that, we can. And if there's similar material in like, I don't know, chapters 5 and 6, maybe we'll cover that. But unless otherwise noted, just read the next chapter. And does anybody have? Can I just pass that around? Get email addresses, and I will email out discussion questions ahead of time.
Okay, awesome.
It's 14 chapters.
Yeah, and I kind of figured I might go through and see if there's 1 or 2 or 3 that can be combined just in the interest of brevity. Because the last ones are the epilogue, whatever the appendix are
15 chapters.
yeah. So we probably will combine at this point. We'll.
I have to say, it felt like I wanted to.
All right.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it wasn't like it was boring.
It's
to hang
hard
out,
to,
so.
it's hard to.
Yeah, it's written very well and very easy to read.
Graphic novel form, it's really good.
Well,
Well, I saw the movie. It was amazing.
If you do have Audible, there is.
Oh, is it on Audible?
Yeah.
That's because the commute.
The
That's
commute,
perfect.
I know.
Oh my gosh, that's perfect. I've been blowing through David Bentley hard.
This is on
Nobody's
audio?
business.
It is, yeah, it's on Audible.
Michael's cheating.
Audible?
Michael's already, I mean, Michael's returned it.
That's Amazon.
No. Audible is, Amazon brand.
Yeah. It might be on iTunes too, I'm not sure, you can check, but I know it's on Audible. Or as my kids call it, Audible.
Yes. It's hard to annotate on Audible, that's the only downside.
Yeah.
Was it-
It's hard to underline things.
No, that's it, Stan speaking.
Oh, yeah, you can pass it around.
With your book.
That's fine.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, with your book, so we'll run around and collect our belongings.
Okay, well, let's just close with. It is truly meet to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim. Thou who without corruption givest birth to God, the word of truth, Theotokos, we magnify thee. Amen.
Oh, right, I also need to put some money in the store.
I'm trying really hard not to add that to my notes.
Thank you for reminding me.
The list
What do
keeps
you got?
growing and I thought I can at least avoid that.
That's pretty got a traffic citation, I mean.
Seriously.